Well, it's been an extraordinary year, hasn't it, for everybody since the pandemic hit March, although we obviously got indications it was coming before then, but of course there was lockdown from the end of March. Now, as a local authority, we were starting to get behind the scenes private conversations going on with central government saying, look, this is now getting quite big and we're going to need to put some measures in place that may require you as local government to really step up to the plate and ensure you can help us make these things happen. And of course, the important thing was that when there was lockdown, we had to ensure that we could continue to run the services that we run for people, even though they were very much based at home. People still needed their bins collecting. We still needed to help with our county colleagues to help those who were shielding, getting food to people, working out what we could do to ensure that all the services that people had, as far as possible, were still able to run. And we had to do that while at the same time taking almost 300 members of staff out of this building so they could work from home. It was a very fine juggling act early on to ensure we could do all that. It was people will remember that every day on the news we were hearing more things, and then the Downing Street press briefings with the government telling us every day what needed to be done. And of course, it needed to be cascaded down to local government, because at the end of the day, we're the ones that tend to provide all the local services. So it was an ever-changing feast. There was a lot going on. But we had to remember also that we had staff who had suddenly found themselves at home with their children who were no longer at school, also feeling quite emotionally stressed out by what was going on. So we had to do that. So it was the early days were I think quite tough. We had the first few months, and we, for example, stopped car parking charges. So it meant that if people did need to get out in an emergency or needed to pick up food, etc., or needed to get in and out the area quickly to pick things up for a relative and so on, they were able to do that without having to worry about finding coins or logging on to anything. It was get in there, get your stuff and get out. We stopped car parking charges across the area, and that was quite important. We provided services via the phone. Obviously, if people still needed to find out about what was going on, they couldn't come into the offices here, but they could find out by picking up the phone. We had to ensure that our online provision, our website, was kept up to date with all the latest information, because very often if you would see something on the news, you'd be seeing a national picture or a national message, and people needed to try and understand how that affected them here locally. You've also got to remember that in Hertsmere, around a third of the people the working population would be travelling, would be commuting in historically into London from Weybridge Potters Bar, from Bushey, from Bournemouth and so on. So there was a whole change to the way people were doing things and people needing information and when they were expecting information. So that all sort of began, as I say, that all fell into place. We had to ensure that those local groups and organisations who had to either shut their doors or who were still providing services but couldn't do it necessarily face-to-face, but were running out of money because they weren't getting the usual contributions that charities may get. We had to make sure we had grant funds available to help keep them going, because so much of the work is voluntary, and so many people were volunteering to help, which was fantastic. If the local groups and agencies, the food bank, other local charities had nothing to operate with, then they would end up closing, and that would just exacerbate the problem. So we made sure that we had grants available literally from the word go. As soon as people needed to, they could apply for money. We got rid of the usual rules around certain times of the year that you apply and so on. We made sure that the rates and the business rates and so on that the government was happy to sort of push to one side. We made sure that if people came to us, they needed help with their businesses, we were able to try and put that through as quick as we could. Hertsmere, unfortunately, for a while in the early days, had the highest rate of COVID in the country, the highest rates of death, pro rata in relation to the population. And that caused us great concern as well, and we had to look at the reasons why that was. And there were a variety. We had quite an elderly population, one of the most elderly in Hertfordshire. A lot of residential homes for the elderly. The second most diverse borough and district in Hertfordshire, I think after Watford, so a lot of the BME communities as well. And also such a large number of our population that were travelling and commuting into London to work. Now you add that perfect storm together, and what we got for a period of time, very high numbers of people who were being infected and sadly dying from COVID. So that was a shock as well, and residents were reading about that because it was in the national news and in national newspapers. So again, it was very important that we did whatever we could to ensure that residents felt as calm as possible. And them knowing that we knew that and that we were putting measures in place to ensure that, as I've said previously, that they could get in and out of town quickly, not have to pay for parking, get their food, get their medication, get whatever it was they needed, and get back home again, pick up their bins to make sure there wasn't piles of rubbish everywhere. That was a hard time for all of us, because we had to do all sorts of planning, which we couldn't tell the population about at the time, for if there were large numbers of deaths, and for the councillors, the elected members, and for staff here. We obviously knew things that we had to be prepared for, which we couldn't necessarily tell the people about. And that made it difficult. We've all got families. You go home of an evening, and all you just want to do is rest and hold your child and just hope that the next day brings something better. But we got through that. And that's because people, by and large, obeyed the rules around social distancing, lockdown, and so on, and now with the masks and so on. And I'm really rather pleased that Hertsmere now has a very, very low rate of infection. And in recent weeks, there've been some days when there've been none at all. And I think we've fallen to, 4th place in Hertfordshire. I think several areas have actually got higher infection rates than us now. Now, it's not a competition, and it's not a league table. But what is important for our residents to know is that for the advice that the government gave, and through the support that we gave, along with what we requested people to do as well, it's working. Part of the recovery phase is to ensure that we're planning very much for the future. So there were some major applications going on in relation to planning. And probably the biggest one that was going on was the Sky Studios application. And residents may recall that Sky Studios, which was partly to do with Sky, NBC and Universal, put in a planning application to build 12 soundstage studio in Bournemouth, £250 million build, 2,000 new jobs, and they would spend £5 billion in the first 5 years on productions, dramas, etc., and so on, and it would become the biggest HQ for this company outside of America, all over the world. Now, that was going on behind the scenes as well, and it came to planning, and all our meetings that we have had have been held in, everyone's had to phone in from home, as it were. So we've held these virtual meetings, but we've made sure that everyone could see them and dial in and watch them, or watch them on the webcast also. And that's a huge application. That went through, and we had to have a socially distanced photo call with the people from Sky and the people from Legal and General who own the land, because this is a huge investment in the future. And it means there'll be more training of local people, and couldn't come at a better time with both the UTC and with the University of Hertfordshire in relation to media. Lots of jobs for building, and then the studios come up, so there'll be lots of jobs for the industry, and local businesses will do well as a consequence of having all that money coming into the area. At the same time, the BBC have been working very hard during lockdown to rebuild the East Enders stage. And I was visiting the studios a week or two ago, and they're managing to do all that socially distanced, but they're rebuilding there. So you've got their studios, which does Holby City and does EastEnders, and we've got our studios, the one that the council owns, Elstree Studios, where The Crown is made, Strictly's coming back, and hopefully we're about to start building 2 new sound stages in the not too distant future, so that we can open them up by March 2022. But we've got social distance measures in place. People have their temperatures, have to wear their masks, etc., and so on. And that's all done to get the industry turning over again, because that means that in our area here, British Hollywood is back again, and that's going to be very important moving forward, because it brings lots of money into the economy. Now, it may be Elstree and Bournemouth Studios, but all the money comes to Hertsmere from Elstree Studios, and the others pay business rates, and that helps us provide services for the whole of Hertsmere. So that's 100,000 people all benefit from that, and 20% at the moment of the council tax from Hertsmere is paid for the whole of Hertsmere by the studios. So we're looking also to ensure that we are very much looking at economic recovery. We've started work again on our development company, which means that Hertsmere will build homes to be able to rent out to people who are the homeless and help our homeless and so on. And that's something I think is very important also. So we've not been idle. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, as I've said, because I think one thing that would be worse than a pandemic would be to have done nothing and to come out of it and say, well, what are your plans now for the future? And say, well, we haven't really thought about any. Not in Hertsmere. In Hertsmere, we've worked very closely with officers, outside organisations, outside groups, and cross-party to see what we can do to take Hertsmere forward. We also have to remember that Hertsmere has areas of great wealth, but also has areas of great deprivation. There is no one-size-fits-all in Hertsmere. We are different communities, different backgrounds, different races, religions, and so on. And it's very important that we make sure we look after everyone. And so there are areas, there's one in Bournemouth, in Cowley Hill, a particular part of which is one of the most deprived areas in the county. And so we have to make sure that we are there to find out why that is the case. Have they suffered more as a consequence through COVID? Have they had more cases? And if so, why? Is poverty or deprivation one of those causes? And we think that it could be. And so we need to learn the lessons of what we can do moving forward to ensure those that have suffered unduly more than others, why that is and what we can do about it. And of course, while people were at home watching television, they're looking at the news, and there was, after a period of time, big news coming from other parts of the world, and things that really struck a chord with people and really affected the way they thought about things. And I think the death of George Floyd in America at the hands of the police was something which shocked everybody. And I think what it brought to the fore, not just in America, but across the world as the effect rippled, was the concerns around racism. And all sorts of discussions were started about racism. And in Hertsmere, we have the second most diverse population in Hertfordshire, other than Watford. Different races, different colours, creeds, religions, gender, and so on. And it was therefore highly appropriate that when we did have a council meeting, that we used a cross-party motion. That means an opportunity where all the parties together could come together to discuss an item. And one of the things that we wanted to discuss as a council was racism. The Labour opposition leader proposed the motion. And we have a lovely councillor called Councillor Victor Ennie on the Conservative side who seconded it. And I didn't speak on the motion as leader, all the other leaders did. And the reason was because I wanted Victor Ennie, who is black and who has lived in our area 30, 40 years, and who has lived in his particular home for 20 years, where when he comes home some days, some of his neighbours still say to him, "What are you doing over here? When are you going back?" It's more important that he gets up and says what the experience is like for him, being called names, when you're going back to where you came from. He said, "But I live here, this is where I come from." People need to understand that. Because what they don't need is to be told by people who don't experience it necessarily in the same way, this is what we should be doing. Listen to the people who are actually suffering it, and we hold our heads in shame if we do nothing about it. But we don't hear, and we listen, and we talk with our groups. And as I said, there's lots of different groups and agencies that we work together with. And I think if people understand that they are part of the conversation, if people understand that they are considered as being all part of one big community in Hertsmere, I think if they feel that, then these types of issues can be discussed openly, frankly. They're hard to have, but we need to have them because the world is having them. It brought us all together. And I think that lockdown has done that. I think it's given people an opportunity to just take a look at their lives and look at the lives of people around them and those that carry out services for them. And I've seen people thanking the police. I've seen people thanking the bin men, the people who pick up the refuse, who have the hardest, dirtiest, smelliest, most awful job, and often get the most criticism, but go out in any weather, very, very hot or very, very cold, and people say, "Oh, thank you for doing that, thank you for doing that." We're doing it in the supermarkets. People are stocking the shelves or putting our things through the till. "Oh, thank you so much." And I think that we've got to that stage now as a country and hopefully as a world. I hope that won't wear off. I hope that when all this goes and there's no more of this and hopefully a vaccine that sorts it all out, I hope we won't lose that newfound humanity. Because I think it's that will, if you've got to say what comes out of this that's good, if it's an uptake in humanity, if it's something that's good for the environment because we're using less emissions from cars, but yes, that's very important, but humanity, if we can honestly turn around and say we are better people as a consequence of something that came, then I think we've all done a great job.